This film is about a 10-year odyssey of two voyages in support of the theory that the first Polynesians came from the Americas. A theory that's supported by people like Thor Heyerdahl, who in 1975 at the Pacific Science Congress came flat out and said that the theory was proven. In order to lend more credence to it, in 1968 a search was started for a tree to make a large dugout. The search took place along the shores of British Columbia into inlets and fjords. There was 2 months spent on the Squamish River in search of the right tree because the ancient people used to use the rivers as highways. They would blank out a heavy canoe, bring it down the river, and finish it at tidewater. The ever-ending search on the rivers was looking on one side or the other for a cedar tree of the right diameter and the right consistency, one that seemed fairly sound. And the instructions and patterns of the canoe were in my head that were taken down at the turn of the century. The name Orenda was chosen for the voyages and for the canoes. It's an Indian name that means a spiritual harmony with the world around you, or a power you get from being tuned in with the world. After spending all this time in search for the tree, occasionally traveling in a dugout which was 115 years old and shaped like a salmon. The dugout was part of the first experiment because the theory has it that the natives twin-hulled their large canoes, covered them with their house boards and special cross pieces, and then took off on their voyages. Evidence shows that they always thought of the oceans as rivers, that if you got into a current and traveled with the wind and the current, you were going to end up somewhere. In 1969, I went high up into the mountains above Squamish, and at the 2,500 foot level found a grove of cedar trees, and I hoped out of that I would find a good solid one. Finally spotted one, kept my fingers crossed that it was solid, and prayed to it that it wouldn't break or split when it fell, and promised it a good and useful future, same way the old instructions tell you to do it. I started to fall it. That now the search is ended and the work of building a dugout starts. When I got the chainsaw into the tree, I discovered it was a little punky, but kept my fingers crossed it'd be solid. Well, after cutting 40 feet of wood from the stump up to the farther up the tree, I found it reasonably solid, and with a diameter in a little less than 5 feet, I started knocking some weight off. I cut a section 50 feet long, which was to be the length of the canoe, and I calculated that that log must have weighed about 10 tons. At that level on the mountain, the winters sometimes leave about 25 feet of snow, so I cut holes in the log so that if it filled with water it wouldn't turn to ice, and split the canoe. I took some weight off, but I didn't want to take too much, or it would weaken the log and it might split on the trip down to the water. The ocean was 8 miles away, and I wasn't entirely sure how I was going to travel. But anyway, I kept working. With the fall approaching, I always kept a fire going for Friendly next to me. And after a month or so living next to it up in the mountains, I was getting it closer and closer to the time I'd take it down to the salt water. It was 200 feet from a logging road, and I used scrap wood to fill in cavities and holes, and cleared brush, hoped I'd cleared a fairly good trail, and trimmed the log and made it as smooth as I could. And then, on the day that we were to take it to the water, we discovered the first snowfall of the year the night before, clawed our way up the mountain, 4-wheel drives, and it took about 3 hours because underneath that snow there was glaciation, sheets of ice that were occasionally 500 to 1,000 feet long, where underground springs had been flowing across the gravel and freezing. The snow was an unexpected friend or foe, I wasn't sure. The log would slide more easily on snow, but I was afraid too that it might go too quickly, and it was a very steep logging road I had to go down on. The ancient canoe carvers, of course, would have had their cedar trees down close to the water anyway, and rough them out a little more and then get the whole village to come down and assist. But we had a 4-wheel drive that weighed about 2 tons, and that was supposed to pull an 8-ton log down the mountain, so there was a lot of apprehension. One of the fears was that the log would slide away too quickly, so I put a chain around it, not only to slow it down from sliding, but I was afraid if it had some bad bumps it might suddenly split. I was also afraid on the steep slope down to the main road that it might go too fast, so I put a rope around it and wrapped the rope around the stump. That was a move that wasn't too necessary as it turned out, but after a false start in which the log didn't move, we repositioned the truck, put on full power, and gave it everything we had, and by golly, it started to move. Had 200 feet to go down to the main road. It hung up on a bump before we got there, and then it jumped 20 feet, and before it went across the road and down 200 feet down the canyon, taking the truck with it, it stopped. Now we had 8 miles to go across the snow and down the mountains. Had an awful time getting it started, and realized that if it ever stopped on an absolute flat area, it'd be very difficult to get it going again. One of my fears was the ice that was underneath the road in some of the steep places. Our cameraman dashed ahead at one point to get some look at it going past. It rolled, pushed him down into the snow in between 2 stumps, and before it went down in the canyon, it just stopped and kept going. Further down the mountain, when we were following it with a 4-wheel drive, we watched the log start to speed up, and a frightened face of the driver looking out the back window, so he speeded the truck up, knowing that if the log hit the truck it might be game over for him and they'd both go over the cliffs. And around the corner and down, it ended up them both doing 45 miles an hour with the log chasing the driver down, but he made it. Then after sitting the winter down by tidewater. A little work being done, but most of it spent just shoveling snow. In the spring I started work in earnest. Now I'd hoped to depart in June. Some of the best currents and winds are at that time of the year, and they should have been about 85% correct behind the canoe, and current travels at about 14 knots a day. And I was discovered that the instructions of carving a canoe, of taking a log and chopping off all the parts that don't look like a canoe, are rather simplified, and the amount of work was phenomenal. Now the theory suggests that the migrating peoples twin-hulled 2 canoes, but to carve 2 50-foot canoes was a little bit too much. So the secondary hull was made out of a log about the size of a telephone pole that had the top taken off, was hollowed out, and then put back together again. June was already on me and passing when we started painting it. I had figureheads that had been carved long before. They were on as good luck emblems, and we're working like mad to get it into the water. During my carving, the native people used to stop by every day and wish the project good luck. Some of them were working on the logs in the booming grounds. The chiefs from hundreds of miles away used to come around to say hello and just wish the project good luck. Always when I needed it, people would show up to help. It was just marvelous. There was an old man that looked after the dump machine and had worked for the company for something like 30 years. He watched the canoe grow every day and gave up his Sunday, saying, I want to be the one that runs the machinery to lower it into the water. I don't want to see anything happen to it. So that pleased me very much. This launching ritual in ancient days would have been a high point of the life of a whole village. Everyone would have turned out, and possibly up to 100 people would have carried a canoe gently into the water. Everything seemed fairly set up. I was running behind schedule. The cabins had to be put on yet, but I had the sails and rigging, and felt reasonably apprehensive. Here was a couple of years of my life, now letting the canoe touch the salt water for the first time. There's always a fear that there may be a hidden seam or a knot hole that will let go and cause a leak. Fear too that those cables would slip or break and damage the hull or even destroy it. But everyone that was helping was extremely careful. Now the balance between the main and the secondary hull was sheer guesswork. There was no architectural drawings to explain how heavy things were, so I was just hoping that not only would it be watertight, but the balance of the 2 hulls would be good. And it was. Not a drop of water came in. It looked just great. The main hull was a little higher, but we knew that would settle down with the supplies and stores to go on board. A good feeling. And the crew, unbeknownst to me, figured that if the canoe were launched properly, that the carver should be launched as well. The water comes out of glaciers right up above and is plenty cold. Now we had a distance of about 70 miles to travel into Vancouver, where the last work was going to be done on the canoe, so with a few friends I headed off and down Howe Sound. We were absolutely flabbergasted because now it was July and we were hit by a snowstorm right at water level. So we tied up for the night and headed off the next day. Realized that we had a freeboard of about 9 inches on the canoe, and I wondered just how that would work at sea with the high waves. But things seemed to be going along pretty well so far, so I wasn't too worried, just rather anxious to get going. There are pilot charts on the Pacific Ocean that tell you the winds and currents for every month of the year. They said should get going no later than July. At our last cove in West Van, we put the rest of the supplies aboard. The cabin still had to be made, but I wanted to spend a couple of nights on one of the Gulf Islands and just rest up under a tree before I did some more work. So the anxiety of getting going. During the day there was a lot of 7-Up and Coca-Cola drank, and there was a pretty cheerful crowd there after a few hours, ready to wave the canoe goodbye. One of the fears, because the length was 50 feet and it seemed to be rather hard to steer, that I might run into another boat or into the rocks on each side, but people at the last minute came down, and people that used to supply us with our river running rafts and put aboard a yellow dinghy, which I sort of reluctantly took because I felt the canoe itself was raft enough. But there it was as an extra safety factor. Now the Raw expeditions the year before, Raw number 1 across the Atlantic in Reed boat by Thor Heyerdahl, had experienced a lot of problems with their steering sweeps snapping. So that wouldn't happen to me, I carved a steering sweep that was 17 feet long and weighed 250 pounds. And on my first experience offshore, I realized that if my self-steering device didn't work, I might have to be standing for 50 days all the way to Hawaii. Not too pleasant a thought, but anyway, things were going all right. Kept going, looking forward to spending a couple of nights on the island and visiting with friends. I did have a self-steering device which had to go in rather deep water. Tested that out in the Gulf and found that it wasn't working. I had an offer from a friend who is an ex-naval commander that if things were too difficult for one person, that he'd put his bookstore into someone else's hands and come with me. Well, it turned out that the self-steering device didn't work. A 3-day jaunt out at sea was just too cruel, standing up. So I turned back to Victoria and was joined by David Moon. Our groceries were in garbage cans with lids tied down so they'd stay reasonably watertight. And with him on board, we left in the evening for the 100-mile trip down through the Juan de Fuca Straits to the open ocean. Weather was fairly calm, and for the first few days we had extremely good weather some friends in a follow-up boat that had hung in all the way across for a week waved us goodbye, and we turned and we were on our own. The second night at sea, we went through the Russian fishing fleet of about 17 factory ships. We did a knot and a half, and were afraid that one of them would speed up during the night and run us down. On the third and fourth day, we ran into 100 boats of the tuna fleet. By this time we were offshore about 50 miles, and then the weather changed, and we ran into a 65-knot gale that gave us 35-foot waves. There only being 2 of us aboard the canoe, at times like that, we had to literally fight for our lives, and cameras were just left in their containers. We found that we were pumping for hour after hour to keep the water out of the vessel. The 50-foot length was dipping both the bow and the stern in occasionally, although we discovered that the long overhang gentled it beautifully when we were racing down the steep waves. Instead of nosediving in, the long bow would gently lift us out. Our bedding became absolutely saturated. The humidity normally is very bad, and we found our sleeping bags were tearing apart. In the calm after the first storm, after a full week of getting hammered, we had 2 days of a bit of sunshine, and then felt the weather picking up again. As a storm was developing, it drove the secondary hull under the water and broke 2 ropes and ripped our inflatable boat off. Because the waves at that time were about 15 feet high, we couldn't see forward or behind, and watched our boat being blown from one wave crest to another. We chased it directly downwind, hoping that we'd find it, just about ran over it, ran ahead of it, dropped our sails and waited for it. It was blown past us about 50 feet away, and we did that for 8 hours. On about the 8th hour, after sailing past the yellow dory, dropping our sails and waiting for it, I watched it come up behind us, and obviously it was going to miss us by about 15 feet, so I did a very foolish thing. I jumped overboard, grabbed the dory, and at the same time grabbed the trailing rope and was almost pulled apart. The force, even with the sails down, was phenomenal, and we were still making reasonable speed. I realized then that if a person went overboard while we were under sail, there was practically no way of ever being able to be found again. The clutter of the vessel required that safety belts were very difficult to use, so we didn't bother with those. We just hung on as tightly as we could. We went into a second gale. We discovered some more 30-foot waves. During the night, the tops were blowing off the waves. My partner's solution to problems like that was to put on the little stove and make a cup of tea. Of course, the cup of tea would be half salt water by the time it got to your lips, and a biscuit would be all soggy before it got to your mouth. But it turned out that is one of the best solutions. After the second gale, we had a day of clear, and then, with our radio broken down but a little transistor still operating, which told us that there was a southwest gale due, we thought, gee, we're going to get hammered into the coast, so we'll head for San Francisco. We'll get the vessel stove fixed and the radio fixed and then head out again. But in the heavy fog off San Francisco, we hit a reef and didn't make it. The vessel split from one end to another, the mast trapped Dave in the wreckage, and after getting him out, we were swept over the top of the reef and into the cliffs. Quite a shock, because we were looking forward to some hot meals and a warm bath. We had been shivering for 3 solid weeks at sea. We're 30 miles from the Golden Gate Bridge, and expected that after the stove and radio was fixed that it would be home free and into the trade winds all the way to San Francisco, to Hawaii. Even our containers were dragged back out through the waves with the current, and the Coast Guard fellow that came down said that, "Gee, you're sure lucky." I said, "What do you mean? There's 2.5 years of my life being turned into splinters." He said, "Yes, but you're still alive, aren't you?" And he told us about 3 of the Coast Guard men who died right at that point just a week before. They were on a 38-foot self-righting lifeboat, which did hit the beach, but they weren't ever found. Our rope that had trailed behind us all the way from Vancouver with a Javex bottle on the end as a safety line spun around, and we tried to pull the wreckage into the sandy beach. It was marvelous the way the Coast Guard jumped right into the water and helped. It was also crazy because some of the things we were saving were BC water. We had carried about 60 gallons in plastic bottles. We saved some of the gear in watertight containers, saved the figureheads, and also saved a silver medallion that an Indian silversmith in Victoria had nailed to the hull with an old stone hammer. But it was quite a state of shock. We were very wobbly after shivering and getting bounced around for 3 weeks, and found that the wreckage went and hung up on a rock and didn't quite make it into the sand where we would be able to rescue things more easily. A lady came down to the beach and asked if we had any money, and when I said no, she loaned us $40, said if you can pay that back, fine. If not, that's fine too. But we did pay it back, and found that the response of people who had helped in so many ways from the very inception right through to that was one of the nice things about the trip. After a week's time, a truck was sent down from Canada to take us and some of the gear that we'd saved back. So on our way home, we went down to the beach to have a last look at what might have happened. We discovered the wreckage was still there that the lashings had held, and I wondered to myself, could I possibly ever do that again? Voyage of the Orenda, Reel 2. In 1977, I found a log to start the second voyage. The log was a tree that was felled some 10 years ago in a park, a butt diameter of about 9 feet, hollow, broken off at 150 feet in the air, a tree over 600 years old, and 24 feet from the stump. It was solid enough to give me a log 40 feet long, 7 feet in diameter. The log, because this was a fir tree, weighed 18 tons and would have had the capacity to turn out over 10,000 board feet of lumber. I basically shaped it in the woods and then had to wait 6 months to get 3 pieces of equipment together: a low bed truck and a crane and a bulldozer. And after an $800 bill, I got it moved 2 miles up to a little glade in the woods where I was to finish it. Now the outside of dugouts are finished first, and then holes drilled through. I stayed as authentically correct as I could. The ancient people used to drill the holes down, and then when the canoe was turned over and you started hollowing from the inside, when you came to a hole, you knew what depth you were, because on a dugout canoe, if you go too far, you can't back up. I discovered that fir wood was about 3 times as difficult as cedar, and was very seldom used in the old days, but here was a log that normally would have cost me in excess of $3,000, and so I wanted to make use of it. My adzes, some of them are patterned after the ancient stone elbow adzes that are found on the northwest coast and right through the Polynesian Islands. I have over 200 pages of evidence to support the theory that the first Polynesians came from the northwest coast. The theory is that probably the first Polynesians got to their island of, say, Easter Island from Peru about 2,000 years ago, and then were overrun by people from the northwest coast who were the first people to land on the Hawaiian Islands, and then traveled right through. Some of the supportive evidence is things like blood study groups done in the Melbourne Serum Lab in 1968. There are 3 or 4 journals turned out by Thor Heyerdahl that outlines the theory as well. The latest book is Early Man in the Oceans, published in 1979. In between the 2 voyages, in an effort to keep things going, I carved a 22-foot canoe and sailed across the Gulf of Georgia, it with a secondary hull, learning a little bit about lashings and techniques, learning from the first old black canoe that was 115 or 118 years old, from the first voyage in the 50-footer, studying canoes from the few that are left in museums from around the world. I have dimensions of most of them that are still around. And after trying very many techniques to make cabins, I reverted to the ancient method, used cedar limbs that bent naturally, and ended up being so strong that they could take breaking seas right over the top of them. In all, the canoe, with its lashings, and ropes and rigging, used up over a mile of cordage. It was amazing, and things like these cuddies were to take 2 and 3 days to complete, with the tying and getting the limbs and what have you. Sometimes I just couldn't believe where the time was going. Now, this canoe has ended up being the world's largest dugout. The main hull is 6 feet in beam and 40 feet long. And because with the twin hulls it was going to be 14 feet wide, we realized to move it down to the ocean that it would have to be done in sections. So I had a small trailer for the secondary hull that in itself is a seaworthy canoe, and another boat mover was to help me with the main hull. From 18 tons, the log has diminished down to about 3 tons. So I threw away 15 tons of wood chips. I had more carvings by this time, and off we went down to the ocean, where I hoped in 2 weeks' time I'd have the canoe ready for the water. I had put stubby masts into the secondary hull. They were cross-braced in every which way. I felt that each of the 3 stub masts could lift 3 tons. I knew that there would be fantastic forces on, and I felt that they were overly built, but I was to find at sea that they started to work loose on me. Friends with a boatyard down at Fisherman's Cove had kindly opened up enough space to put the canoe into, and had the equipment to launch it. The secondary hull had containers in for foodstuffs and a drum for either flotation or extra heavy ballast. The hull has been patterned after the northern canoes found in the Americas, canoes that have proven themselves for thousands of years. To stop the checking on the main hull, I had coated it with approximately 25 gallons of oil that just supersaturated the wood,